Today we're going to continue in a series that we've been on, and this is the last week in the series of David. If you have missed the last couple of weeks, I would encourage you to go back on our YouTube channel, and would you find those messages and engage with them? It's going to help you to follow what's going on today. If you were here on Father's Day, we were in this series, and I did something on Father's Day. I brought you guys a compass. Do you guys still have your compasses? And I shared that a couple weeks ago, I talked about how I've hooked my clock to my compass. And so I oftentimes walk around with this crazy looking thing. And when I gave out these compasses, one of the things I shared with the men and even with the women who would receive it, that my invitation was to focus on direction over time, right? That oftentimes we're focused on time, and so it's my pocket watch, but I'm learning in this season that God is actually not just care about like my time, but he also cares about my direction. Because if I go in the wrong direction over time, it doesn't matter, right? But I need to focus not just on when to go or where to go, but I also need to focus on the Spirit of God as he's leading. And so this is just a reminder that I have had. And so today, as we end this series, I've titled my message, Time to Move. That it's a clock about time, but it's also the compass, which is about where and how. I wear a Fitbit, and my Fitbit does a really good job at telling me it's time to move. If you guys have any of these devices, if you sit for too long, they begin to tell you, you need to get up and start moving if you're going to get your steps, if you're going to get your active minutes, if you're going to get these goals. They tell you when it's time to move. And there's a signal in that as my Fitbit went off this past week, I thought to myself that I need to know when it's time to move. And I said that as a church family, we don't just want to pray for a move of God without learning how to move with God. Many people pray for a move of God. God, would you come? God, would you move? God, would you do? And then when he does, you're like, I don't like it. But we have to learn not just to pray for a move of God, but how do we move with God when he comes? We must be willing to move with God. That sometimes I've shared that I feel distance from God. Like God is so far from me. But what has actually happened, I've come to find, is that he has moved and I have stayed. And the issue is not him, it's me. It's not you, it's me. The problem is that he has moved on and I haven't learned to move because I'm waiting for time. Because I've been told a lie that time changes things. Okay, all right. Yeah, I see it in your face. Pull back, Denvil. I got that tattoo. I had a friend of mine that had that tattoo in his arm. And this is a couple years ago before I learned to be tactful. And I said to him, how does it feel to have a lie tattooed on your shoulder? I know. I was in my 20s, and I was just the horrible person. But things don't change with time. Because I've been in the same place for a long time. There's some things I've been wrestling with for a long time, and it has not changed. Things do not change over time. Things change by God and movement and direction in the Spirit. You could be in the same place for a long time, and today I believe I have a word from the Lord to tell you it's probably time to move. Okay. Come on, Jesus. This is about being unstuck. This is about being unstuck. It could be in your personal world, like where you find that you're stuck in your mess, like stuck in habit, stuck in pain, stuck in grief, stuck in what happened, and unable to move. I believe that there comes a point where the Spirit of God would up and tell you, baby, it's going to be okay. It's time to move. I find that in my personal life, I sit down and I beat myself up. You guys will probably have some of this too, to wallow in your sorrow. I do this when I wrestle with any kind of sin in my life and I refuse to move on from it, I find myself reenacting it. I get stuck on it. I'm just stuck on stupid for a really long time and I don't know how to break a cycle and I don't know how to move. So in my personal life, I find that I do this. In offense, sometimes I don't know how to move from offense and I reenact it and I rehear the voices and I rehear what you say and I cannot move and I get stuck. And I believe the Lord may say to you this morning, it's time to move. Sometimes it's in my life with God, things that I don't understand. There's some things theologically I just refuse to move until I understand them. I don't know why. And until I know why, I can't move from this place. And God would say, I'm moving and you have a choice. Even in the things that I don't understand, I'm learning that it's not my understanding that dictates my movement. It's when God moves, I need to move with him. That even things that I don't get and I don't understand and I want answers don't move me, God does. And so in places where I don't have answers, I'm learning that I need to be able to move with God in my grief and in my frustration and in my disappointment. Like even if God tells me why, I still need to move. So when he doesn't tell me why, I still need to also move. that this is the place where we find the story of David. That David has been moving from being a shepherd, and he's a warrior, and he's with Goliath, and he's with Saul, and he's taken the Ark of the Covenant, he's going into Jerusalem, and we find him moving, and he's moving, and he's moving. And in this story between 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we find that David gets stuck. He gets stuck. If you remember last week in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we found that David was stuck in Jerusalem at the palace while the men were still pressing forward. That at the time when kings go out to war, David stayed at home. He was stuck on top of the roof while the men were taking ground. Okay. And it was in that place where he looked, oh yonder, and he saw a woman bathing on the roof. And he goes and finds out that this woman is not just any woman, but she's the wife of one of his military generals, one of his mighty men. And he takes her and sleeps with her over a period of time. And just so that you know, I didn't preach last week, and I wish I did, because I wanted to tell you that that it wasn't a mistake that David made and he was mad. The way that the text read, David slept with her over a period of time. This wasn't like a one-night thing. This was a season. The only problem David had was when she got pregnant. And when this happened, he ran into this great big issue, and he does what I do, and I suspect I'm not the only one. He tries to hide, he tries to pretend, and he tries to cover up. If you're uncomfortable, I'm not on page 2 yet. All right, so let's just, so hear what I'm trying to say. There's something about being real and honest and vulnerable. I've shared before that sometimes people like when I talk about things that don't matter, but I don't want to waste my time or yours. There are things that you hide. There are things we cover up, and there are things that we pretend. And those are the things that I'm wondering, do you know when it's time to move? And do you know where to move when it's time to move? And I'm learning some things that I don't do it perfectly, but I've journeyed into some of this, and maybe I can invite you into some things that I have learned along the way. For all of chapter 11, David spends time trying to hide and cover up what he did. All of chapter 11. And for the rest of the book, God doesn't let him. God does not let him hide. God would say, David, you cannot escape this, even as we go through chapter 11. When you get to chapter 12, still can't make it. Get to the New Testament, she is still Uriah's wife. David never gets to escape what he's trying to hide and cover up and pretend. In chapter 11, if you go there with me really quick, you see David's first attempt, right? He gets Bathsheba pregnant, and then he goes and he calls Uriah back. This is Bathsheba's husband, and he says, hey, why don't you take a break from war? Because he's pretending to be a good leader. You could have so much pretense that you bring out the best in you to cover up the worst in you. Hey, that David says, I'm a good leader, I'm a good king. Why don't you come and take a break? Take a break, Uriah. And he brings Uriah back, and look at what he says in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 8. David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And so he went down, and he even gave him a gift. He gave him a gift. But anytime I try to do cover up, there's always a but. But it didn't work. All right. He tried to create a space where Uriah would go and sleep with his wife, and so he could be like, Uriah, you are the father. Those of you who watch daytime talk show get it, okay? But it didn't work. All right. So attempt number 2. Next night, he brings Uriah in. He gets Uriah drunk. This is verse 13. And when he was drunk, Uriah didn't go. Another but. Second attempt to cover up my sin and my mistake and my debauchery. Didn't work. I can't hide it, can't cover it. All right. Third attempt. Third attempt is this. Look at verse 14. In the morning, he wrote a letter, and he sent it to Joab, who's the commander, and he sent it with Uriah and said, hey, put Uriah on the front line so that we could kill Uriah. Because if we kill Uriah, if you get rid of the problem, we'll be good. Sometimes I want to do some crazy things to get rid of issues around me. Like, I'm not the only one. Sometimes thoughts go on inside of your mind where you're like, God, if you would just take him, Lord. If y'all ain't never prayed those kind of prayers, I don't believe you. I'm like, Lord, I won't be mad. I'm not saying you should, but I mean, if you did, Lord. Everything happens for a reason. I don't know. All right. David goes and he kills Uriah, and it seems like it works. It seems like it works for a while. Uriah dies. We go down to verse 26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him, And then David goes and he marries her. It's like now he's a king who gave his soldier a break and he sent him back and he unfortunately dies. But David's a good guy. I'm gonna marry his wife to not make her a widow and care for her. I'm a good guy. No, it's not. The only reason he's marrying Bathsheba is to cover up what he did. It's still a cover up. He marries her to fix it. But still can't get away from it. What he did displeased the Lord. All throughout chapter 11, David tries to cover it up, and God's like, nope. Try to hide it, nope. Try to do this, nope. Marry her. Everybody's like, oh, David's great. God's like, nope. Won't let you hide it, won't let you cover it. And those are the things that really bother me. If I could dive into this thought for a moment, why would David try to cover up what he did to Uriah? Why would David try to cover up the pregnancy? There are many reasons that some of us have bought into as to why David is trying to do this. Like, he's embarrassed. David's not embarrassed. David has taken other wives in shadier ways too. This is not David's first rodeo. David has acquired multiple wives, and he's acquired wives from other men before. So why is he trying to hide this one? It's not because he's afraid of punishment. He's the king. Ain't nobody gonna punish David. So what's he trying to hide in this? He's not trying to cover up fidelity because he's a polygamist. He's not trying to hide the fact that he's taken someone else's wife because he has many wives. So he doesn't have the same standard of morality in marriage as we do. That's not what he's trying to hide. He's not trying to hide it from God because surely he's not stupid. He knows God can see him. So what is David trying to hide as he's doing this? What David is trying to do, this matters because Uriah is one of his mighty men. All of the other people who David, I was going to say screwed over, but I can't say that from the stage. All of the other people that David wronged, all of them are still in chapter 1 to 10. And then we get to chapter 11, and he cares about this one because it's Uriah. And it's not just because he loves Uriah, who's been with him for so many years. When he was in the cave of Adullam, Uriah gave up everything and came to him and fought for him and was one of his 30 mighty men. It's not that. What David cares about is that if this gets out, it's going to weaken his army. Because Uriah is one of the leaders in his army. That David's army is his power team. They're the ones that are taking on Canaanites and Amorites, and they're taking on territory for David. They're bringing him victory, and they're the ones keeping him enthroned. If his army starts to lose battles, David will no longer be king. So I've got to keep my military force strong. Because if I lose my military, I lose my throne. And so David is trying to cover up, not because he cares for Bathsheba, not because he cares for Uriah, but because David cares for David. And I know this because I have found my David. Okay, you haven't yet. Or maybe you won't admit it yet. Maybe I shouldn't have either. But he's concerned for the morale, the confidence of his military, and his troops. So David is protecting his might. He's protecting his military might. Can I go deeper? He's protecting his military might because it is his power source. He believes it's his power source. I have found that we will protect whatever it is we believe is giving us life. We will protect whatever it is that we believe, like hold this high authority in our lives, like your reputation. You think that you're loved because you have a good reputation, so you'll fight and do whatever you need to do to protect it. That's why you care when people speak ill of you. That's why you care that's why you care what people think about you, because what they think about you is what makes them love you, and you want to be loved. And so that's why we put on and pretend and dress up, and we try to bring our best foot forward, because I need to protect my reputation, because it is the means by which I get love and is what I need. Are you guys with me? This is why we lie. We lie to protect our reputation, to protect the wrong that we did, because if you think ill of me, then you won't love me, and that's my power source. That gives me life. Whatever you believe is giving you life, you will fight to protect it. Some people do this in politics, I have found, that I will fight you because I'm so connected to this thing that identifies me, and it's who I am, and it's who we are, and I will fight you in order to protect it. For some of us, it's our rightness. Like, if you think you are who you are because you got stuff right, you will protect that rightness by any means necessary. This is what the Bible calls self-righteousness. If you feel like you've paved the way for yourself and you've worked really hard and you've gotten to where you are because you're a fighter, if you have a sense of weakness that comes into your life, you will hide it, you will lie about it, you will protect it, because strength is why you are where you are. And so as you start to age, you'll do Botox so that everyone will think you're still young. Oh, sorry, okay. Or as you age, you start to dress cooler and younger so everyone can think that you're still young because you think your youth is what got you to where you are. But if I could tell you that whatever you believe got you to where you are, you're gonna fight to protect it, baby, you didn't do it, and that's what God tells David. God tells David, you think you got here because of this army? You think you got here because of these fighting men? Look how God responds to David. He tells him two things. He says, one, don't forget where you came from, and don't forget how you got here. You're trying to protect something that's powerful to you. It's not. And then he says, you seem to have two gods, and you despise one of them, and that one is me. Look how God responds in 2 Samuel chapter 12. I'm going to read the end of it here. This is what the Lord said to David. I have anointed you king over Israel. I have delivered you from the hand of Saul. I have given you your master's house and wives. I have given you all of Israel. I would even give you more, David. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing this evil thing? He says, you struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife for your own. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites. Now the sword will never depart from your house. And if you're in your Bible, I want you to circle that word because. Because you despise me. You chose your might, your reputation, your stuff. God realizes it's not Uriah. It's not that you murdered someone. Wow, that's bad. It's not that you took his wife. Wow, that's horrible. It's that you did it to protect my throne that I have in your life. You did it to protect how you got here and your power source. And what you did, David, is you're protecting this as your power source, neglecting that I, God, am your power source. And by doing so, you neglected your actual power source. That's the problem, David. It's not that you're a murderer. It's that you despise my power in your life by trying to enact the power on your own. It's the same issue Jesus has in the New Testament. It's not your sin, it's your self-righteousness. It's that you try to become righteous by yourself. And by trying to be righteous by yourself, you become unrighteous unto God. The problem is not your sin. The problem is that you try to protect the sin by trying to protect the thing that you think gives you life, neglecting that God is the one who gives you life. That's the irony. That in order to save your life, you must lose it. But if you try to save it, it'll be gone. David is trying to protect the thing that he believes gives him life, his reputation, his military, his might. God says, it is not your military. I was there when you were a shepherd on the back hill of a mountain singing songs into the sky. I'm the one who brought Goliath down. You had no army with Goliath. When you took 100 Philistines' foreskins, no army was with you, David. It was me. I'm the one that brought you there. When you were in the cave with Saul and someone held you back, it wasn't your army, it was me. When you brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, it was not your men, it was me. How dare you try to protect yourself now? How dare you try to pretend that you got here because you chose a few good men and try to protect your army and your reputation. And by doing so, you've cut off your power source. If you try to save your life, you lose it. But if you just lose your life for my name's sake, then and only then will you find it. And so he's trying to hide, not because he's ashamed, but he doesn't want to lose his power source. So this is how the story begins at the top of 2 Samuel chapter 12. I want you to back up now. Let's go to the 2 Samuel chapter 12. The Lord sent Nathan to David. So this is after David marries Bathsheba, and he's like, I got away with it. God's like, okay, you didn't get away with it, David. You're still trying to hide and cover up. So God sent Nathan to David, and when he came to him, this is what he said. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except for one little ewe lamb that he had bought. And he raised it, and he grew it up with his children. He gave it a name and everything. It shared his food, his drink, his cup. It slept in his arms. This lamb was like this man's daughter. And now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare for a meal for the traveler who would come into town. Instead, he took this little lamb that belonged to the poor man, the one that he raised and loved and held in his arms. He took that one and he prepared it for the one who had come to visit him. And David heard the story that Nathan brought to him. David said, what? You mean to tell me this man has all this cattle and sheep, and he goes and finds this one poor man with this one little ewe lamb, and he takes it and kills it to please somebody else? David burned with anger against the man, and this is what he said to Nathan: "As surely as the Lord lives, this man must die," says David. He must pay 4 times over. He wants him to pay 4 times over, and when he pays it, kill him. Because he did such a thing and had no pity. And Nathan says, "Yes, David, you're right." Look at the text verse. "You are that man." This is why they kill prophets. Everybody wants to be prophetic, but nobody wants to die. This is why they kill prophets. Because prophets have a way of letting you stand in the tension of truth that is uncomfortable. See, David does this thing that I do oftentimes. David is willing to kill a man over an animal when he did something worse to a human. Do you guys see this? David does this thing that I do. It's easy for me to judge you. When it comes to other people's stuff, I want justice and judgment. When it comes to my stuff, I want mercy and grace. See, David, if he knew that the story was about him, he would have said something different about the punishment that should be. So what he did was he told him a story about this mythological man, about this fantasy, about this other man somewhere, and truth became present. And then he realized that he stood in the middle of truth. I'm this way in traffic. When you cut me off, you're a jerk. When I cut you off, it's because I'm lost and you should be compassionate. I don't know why you're mad, because I don't know the area well. I just moved here. And why are you so mad? Like, why are you blowing your horn? I thought you're supposed to be like Midwest nice. But like when you cut me off though, I'm like, these people didn't know how to drive. See, it's easy for me to judge you, but then for me, I want mercy and grace. I'm like this with my kids. My kids had a hard day. Your kid has a hard head. Yeah. Like, oh, he's just like that sometimes. But when it's your kid, like, you guys know what I'm talking about. It's easy for us to do this with ourselves. This is why he tells them the parable that he does. It's easy for me to see what's wrong with you, but it's really hard for me to see what's wrong with me. I'm not the only one. It's easy for you to see what's wrong with me. It's easy. You guys are thinking it right now. But it's hard to see what's wrong with you. I have one set of verses when something goes wrong with you, and I have a different set of verses when something goes wrong with me. This is the predicament that David runs into. For David, the real issue is that he didn't realize that he was bringing judgment on himself. This is why in my old age, I'm learning to be careful of how I judge. I know all of you older people are going to say I'm not. I'm getting there. I have a couple grays. This is why I'm learning. David didn't realize that when he was casting judgment on this man, that he was casting judgment on himself. This is why Jesus says things like, the same measure that you use to judge others is the same measure that we use for you. So that's why I'm careful of how I judge others, because I know that the lens I look through to judge you is the same lens I look at in the mirror. And at some point, if David would have realized that it was him, he would have been softer. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the king of Israel would have said, man, that's really hard. He should confess his sin and pay it back, and I'm going to pray for God's mercy to come upon him. I wonder if God would have dealt with David differently. I wonder if God would have enacted the same judgment on David that he would have enacted on another person. I'm suspicious that that's true because Jesus says so in the New Testament. He says the way that you judge is the way that you will be judged. I can't have a set of verses for you and use a different one for me, because in the end, what he's going to judge me by are the ones I use for you, because those are the ones I really believe. I can't have an idea about how you should be dealt with when you do wrong and how I should be dealt with when I do wrong, because he says here's the measure that's going to be used, the one that you use for them. And so David is trying to figure this out, and he didn't enact mercy and grace. So David then said to Nathan, look at verse 13 and 14, I have sinned against the Lord, quick to repent. And Nathan says, God is quick to forgive. Then Nathan said, the Lord has taken away your sin. Good news, you are not going to die. But because you show utter contempt for the Lord, the son that is born will die. Now, I've had many calls about this passage because what? My God wouldn't do that? That seems completely unfair, but if we could just pause and think for a moment. David is not some guy down the street. He's the king of Israel, one. He has entered into a specific covenant with God. And so this is not true about everybody in general. This is the king of Israel who has harmed a family of his military general. That's the first thing I want you to realize. When people say, like, would God do something like this to me when I've sinned? I've said, well, if you're the king of Israel and you do something like this, yeah, I think he would. But you're not the king of Israel, so it's okay. However, I do want to say that there are consequences for our sins. That sin, they do have consequences. And the issue I have with the consequences for sin is that we don't get to choose them. David would have said, Lord, take me, not him. And you would too. If you realize that what you did was going to harm a child, you would say, Lord, take him and not me. You don't get to choose them. You don't get to control them. And can I take this step further? Sometimes you don't get to see them. Sometimes you don't get to see the consequences of your actions. You guys are looking at me. Can I be real for a moment? I'm at a stage in my life where I'm wrestling with the consequences of my father's bad decisions. And my father's dead and gone. See, consequences for our sin, consequences for what we do, live on beyond us. You don't get to pick them. You don't get to choose them. Consequences are very real. And it was in this I started to realize my own hypocrisy. Here is my hypocrisy that I've had in my life, and maybe you've had it in yours too. I'm okay when God blesses Solomon because of David. I'm not okay when God curses Solomon because of David. I want God to respond to some things, but I only want him to reward everything. I want him to respond with kindness, but I never want him to respond in ways that are unkind to me. I want to control the things that God responds to. Like, I would be glad if my father left me $1 million. But I'm mad when he leaves me his patterns and habits. And God is saying, that's your hypocrisy, because you think that the universe works on your preferences. But it just works. That the blessing passes on, and the consequences for mistakes also pass on. And this is just a reality of the tension that we all have to live in. I only want God to be a rewarder. So this is why I like messages about grace. I hate these kinds of messages because I want to hear that God is going to bless me for stuff. I want to hear that God is going to give me good stuff I didn't deserve. Hey, don't you love it when he blesses you with stuff that you didn't earn? Stuff that you didn't deserve? It's like, I didn't deserve this blessing, but look at him blessing me. I love getting stuff I don't deserve. But then when you get other stuff that you don't deserve, you're like, I didn't deserve that, Lord. Whatever. All right. So it's hard to hear, it's hard to read. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that was born to Uriah and David, and he became ill. And I've learned to look at this not from my 21st century Western perspective, but I've learned to learn from David even. David doesn't respond the way that you and I want to respond to this statement. David doesn't say, that ain't fair. How come I get forgiven and to live and he gets to die? David doesn't wrestle with that. Look at what David does. Verse 16, David pleaded with God. He wasn't cursing at God. He pleaded with God. He fasted. He spent the night laying in sackcloth and ashes. The elders tried to get him up off the ground. He's laying on the ground like a 5-year-old crying. And they try to get him up to come and eat. Have you ever fasted and prayed for something so hard? Have you ever asked God to do something, to restore something, to bring something back, and it did not happen? Have you ever said, God, I need you to fix this? Like, I know this is my mess. I know this is what I did, but I need you to fix this. Like, this has gone way too far for way too long. I need your help. I need you to do this. David cried out for 7 days. For 7 days, he's in a room. He will not eat. He will not drink. He will not get up. He will not stop crying. And he's crying out to God. God, this child is dying, and it's my fault, day 1. Day 2 and 3, David is continuing on. I can't blame anybody else but myself. Lord, would you take me instead? Day 4 and 5, he's still, God, I've lost my way, but this child has not. He's pleading with God to restore this child. And while David was praying, verse 18 says that on the seventh day, the child died. That while David was praying, the child died. He has to wrestle with the fact that people suffer from his choices. And then what happened is the attendants come to pick him up. And I want you to see David's response. Because after this happens, he gets up and he just washes himself up, he cleans up, and he just goes. And they get confused, and they're asking why. So David got up from the ground. He washed himself. He put on some lotions because he was ashy. And he changed his clothes. And he went into the house of the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord. It was time to move. He got up, he washed up, he dressed up, and he worshiped because it was time to move. People around him were like, what? For 7 days, you're weeping and mourning and crying. We thought that you were going to die. And now that the child has finally died after the seventh day, you got up and you washed up and you dressed up and you worshiped. Look at David's response to this. He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. Because I thought, who knows? The Lord may be what? Gracious to me and let the child live. But now that the child has died, why go on fasting? Can I bring him back? I will go to him, but he will not come to me. In this tension of the passage, David stands forgiven and the child stands not healed. And I don't want you to miss what happens when your theology hits your reality. Theologically, David has a belief that he's enacting that we hold as well. David believes that the same grace that forgave him also has the power to heal. Are you with me? David said, if God can forgive me, then he can also heal this child. So David spends time praying because he believes that God can heal. David has given us great theology. God can heal. But then that theology meets a reality of when God does not heal. Have you ever believed in God can heal and experienced a God that does not heal? This is when your theology comes into direct contact with your reality and they start to mingle up together. And I want to encourage you, if you've ever been in that place, to do what David did. David doesn't trade the truth of God for the reality of his circumstances. This is a really hard tension to stand in. He doesn't trade the truth that God can heal because he's praying that God would. He doesn't trade that for the reality of his circumstances. So when it doesn't work, some people stop believing in God, stop coming to church because something they believed that God could do, God didn't do. And it messes up like all of our thinking in so many ways. But David teaches us to stand in this tension to say that what I believe God can do is strong over here. But then there's something in my reality that I didn't see him do it. And standing in that tension is what David is kind of demonstrating in this passage that I don't want you to miss. Sometimes I refuse to do something until it makes perfect sense. I confessed this to you earlier. Until it makes sense, I won't move. So I stand in this kind of tension for a really long time and saying, how can I worship a God who has the power to do this, but then he doesn't do it? Some of you might be stuck there. In your own world and in your own life, your theology is messing with your reality. That what you believe here is not happening here, and there's a tension to stand in when things didn't turn out the way that you thought they would. I have learned that most things feel random and arbitrary until I give myself over to them. David is standing in a tension that I believe many of us have been in. And the way he does it is hard to read, but he says, there's nothing I could do from this point. I know that God is still good. And so it's time for me to get up and to move on and to worship God. Some of you have done this. You've lived this in your life. I know people who've gotten divorced who don't believe in divorce. And your theology begins to mess with your reality. And if you've gone through that space in your life, you know what it's like to lay down and to cry and to grieve and to mourn and to ask God why. And you can never really understand it or explain it to someone else. But came that day when you got up and you dressed up and you worshiped again. There's something about this moment that I believe we have to press into if we're going to serve the God of this universe and still be present in this earth. There's something about this moment, if you've ever had tragedy or embarrassment or loss. Like, There are some things that I don't understand why God didn't, but I'll never stop believing that he can. I'll never stop believing that he will. There's something about my theology that must interact with my reality. And this is the part of church that a lot of people get burnt in, because the truth is that, I know that I can never go so far from God that he will not take me back. Right? I know that there are places where I can get at, where God will restore me, that God will lift me up, that God will bring me. But the question is not about his goodness. The question is about me. Will I have the courage to get up? Will I have the courage to wash up and dress up and worship? After being disappointed in what God would not do, would I trade my reality for what God has revealed to me in who he is? This is a tension where a lot of people give themselves over to the reality and say, I believe God should have, and he didn't, and so I'm done. And this is a tension I want to invite you to sit in, because this is the tension where faith is birthed. This is the tension where miracles happen. Anybody can believe in a God who's saving them from their sin and rescuing you. Nobody's wrestling with God as a giver. I love when he blesses me and gives me what I don't deserve that I like. It's the other stuff that makes me want to walk away. I want to spend one side of a coin. It's impossible. I've learned to stand in the tension of the kingdom, because it's in this tension that I see the move of God and my faith begins to grow. It is out of my weakness in that moment where Christ begins to stand up strong inside of me. The moment I leave one of those tensions, the moment I give myself over to, well, God just doesn't heal anymore and he doesn't, and maybe we should just move away from this, and maybe we should just be nice people because God doesn't do this. The moment that we do that, we release the tension and we lose it, and faith begins to diminish and not grow. Or sometimes people go in the opposite direction and say, well, God is always really good, so it must be something wrong with you. Maybe you didn't pray right, maybe you didn't fast right, because my God is really strong and he's really good. And you have distanced your academics, your theology, all of your highness, and now it no longer intermingles with reality and humanity. What I'm trying to say is that you've gotten rid of Jesus, because Jesus is perfect theology and perfect humanity together composite in one body. That Jesus is the one that is highly divine and highly truth, but he's also touched humanity and touched our frailties. That it's in him is the tension of the kingdom. And if we're going to be like Jesus, we've got to stand like Jesus, holding all truth, but still being human enough to take on reality. That's what makes the kingdom come. What makes the kingdom come is when I stand in these two opposites. These two things that are so hard to hold on to. This is where heaven and earth begins to overlap. This is where grace and truth will meet. This is where condemnation and grace will touch. The world that's trying to change is looking for people who will stand in this tension. The world is sick of people who have given themselves over to the reality and say that there's no God. And sick of people who would say that, I know that there's God, there's something wrong with humanity, let us go off into the mountains and hide. But the world is looking for a people who would say, I believe that God can, even though he didn't, but I'm willing to stand with you until he does. The world is looking for a people who would stand with the grace of God and the power of God and the move of God, but also with the debauchery of man and the lostness of man, to stand in the tension of it all. This is who Jesus is. He is perfectly God and perfectly human, and he's perfectly fine. That's what he loves to do. That's the kind of church that I want to pastor and be a part of, and to stand in the tension. Not to deny it, not to blame people because we want to elevate God, and not to lower God to match our reality. Both of those things are horrible ideas. David said, I believe he can heal, so I'm going to pray. But it didn't work, so I'm going to mourn. And I'm going to get back up and I'm going to worship. That's why your family thinks you're crazy. Because you should give up on this thing. But we know that he's not a genie and it's not a magic box and you can't spend one side of a coin. We know that there's something bigger that's going on. Because throughout this whole story, David was fighting against God to hide something, and God kept fighting David so he could use it. See, what he didn't realize is that God wasn't just trying to deal with what he was doing. God was trying to bring something out of this situation that David or you and I did not expect. If you're sleeping, I want you to wake up for a minute. I want you to pay attention to this. This is the part of the story where for so long we would just complain and say, I don't get it. I don't see why. This is horrible. If you stand in the tension for long enough, my friends, I promise you, you will see the goodness and grace and glory of God. If not on this side of eternity, then on the next one. But I promise you that if you stand in the tension on this side, God will release goodness and glory through you. Let me tell you why I believe this. In verse 24, David, after everything has happened, the child has died, he goes in and he comforts his wife Bathsheba. And he went to her and made love to her and gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. And the Lord loved him. And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to say to name him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. It is out of David, dark and messy, depraved, selfish thing, that God brings this amazing thing out of Bathsheba. Now, this is scandalous, and it's wrong, and it's messy, and it hurts, and it was hard. And some of us are uncomfortable with this, and we don't want to give ourselves over to it. And here's why. Because sometimes we feel like moving forward and getting up and progressing is a reward for my sin. And I feel like if I go from bad and step into good and God blesses me, it's like, well, is he rewarding my bad thing? And sometimes God can bless us so good on the back end of something, it seems like he's rewarding the debauchery that we did. This is why Paul says in Romans, like, where sin abounds, grace abounds. And so you might think he's saying you should go on sinning because God is going to give more grace. God forbid it. It should not be so. God does such a good job with grace that it seems as though he's blessing the mess. That's how good it is. That God brings out of this messy situation a king. Not just a king, the wisest king, the richest king, and the king that we have in mind when we say the kingdom of God. That Solomon was the greatest king that Israel ever saw. They never fought a battle. They built the temple. He was wise. Bathsheba birthed something of a miracle out of a mess. And this is something that gets a little bit messy. But God is committed to David even when he fails, and we need that. We need that. I want you to know that you have a God that's committed to you even when you fail. Because you need that. Not everyone will stick with you through your mess. Not everyone is looking to give you your best on the back end of circumstances. But God is loving David through his mess, and we need that. This is why I'm learning, guys. This is why I'm learning to pay attention to the things that I can't easily hide or erase or cover up. I'm learning that there are some things in my pattern and in my behavior and my challenges, like some sinful practices, that there are bad habits, like you may have them too, that you try to hide, you try to cover up, you try to pretend. And I'm learning that what God doesn't allow me to hide, he actually wants to have it. Like David tried so hard to hide this thing and God wouldn't let him. Like some of us have these things in our lives where, like, have you ever had something in your life that you've been trying to shake it for years and you just can't? And it keeps coming back up. Like, you would almost be embarrassed to talk about the things that were in your 20s that's still present in your 50s. The loss you had when you were a teenager that still presents in itself in your 50s. Can't cover it up. Can't hide it. And I'm learning to pay attention because there's some things that God doesn't allow me to hide or cover up because he wants to have glory through it. God doesn't allow David to hide this thing because he wants to have glory through it. That if he doesn't allow me to cover it, he wants to conquer through it. I'm not simply saying stop it. I'm saying let him into it. I'm saying let him into it because he can get glory out of it. And our problem is that this is uncomfortable to us because when we see God do that with other people, it's hard to palate. When we see God blessing people who we think should not be blessed, moving people on that should not be moving on, you know that offense that comes up in your heart? This is recording, so I can't say certain things. I know. This sucks. All right. If there was a nation that put someone in office that should not be there, and the nation got angry, because we would say this is a horrible person that should not be there, because look at what he's done in his life. What I'm saying is that because our heart does that, it's really hard for that same heart to say that God now can bless me because of what I've done. hear me, I'm not justifying anything. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying that when I look at David's life, I'm mad because God didn't dethrone him. Because men have lost a lot more for doing a lot less. And David gets to stay in office. And I'm mad. And I'm even more mad when Jesus comes and he's like, I'm the son of David. Do you mean Solomon? Can you be the son of Solomon? Because when you say son of David, David was a man in power that slept with Bathsheba. So I refuse to call it an adultery. Because Bathsheba cannot say no to a man of power. And then David killed her husband and then married her. And instead of dethroning him like I would, God blesses him and raises him up and births a king out of this crisis. And I'm mad. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's fair. But then that sets the stage for what I believe God could do through my life. That the things I don't deserve and the things that's been hard and the pain that I've had and the wrong that's been done to me, that all the messiness of my life, you remember I told you, what I want for you is not the same thing I want for me, and that cannot be true. That I somehow have to realize that when God is committed to people and wants to bless them, it is not a reward for having a horrible past. It's because he is good. I'm trying to put this into words that you'll get. You have to allow him to be good to other people so you can have a perception that he'll be good to you. Okay, that's it. That's what I'm trying to say, right? You have to allow him to be good to people who don't deserve it so that you have a concept that he will be good to you. Because you don't have four eyes. You only have one set. It's the same set. You have to allow him to be good to people that do not deserve it. So when you get home and you look in the mirror, your eyes work. This is why this is hard. Because I don't like that God would do this to David. Because my theology gets in the way. My sense of justice, my sense of rightness, my sense of mercy. This is unfair. But this is what grace looks like. That I get offended and it's messed up because the child died for what David did. And God brings a great king out of crisis. He could have picked another family. He could have gone to someone who was better, but he didn't. And this is what he chooses to do. God births not just beauty out of ashes. He brings great theology out of a great mess. I want you to hear me for a moment, because this situation, as messy as it is, I don't want to put it aside, that God is setting the stage for something great. Because listen to what I just said, that someone else died for what David did. Listen to what I just said. I said that you can sin and someone else can die. I know that this is all messy and this is all messed up and it should not happen and the child was innocent, but I can say something that it becomes a platform for a great theology that I'm going to appreciate 1,000 years from now, that someone else can die for what someone else did, and in comes Jesus, that Jesus comes on what has been predicated on David's mess, that someone else can die for what someone else did, and God is okay with that. I used to hate it, but when it comes to Jesus, I'm like, somebody else can die for what I did, and I love it. That's why I can't spend one side of a coin, because I hate it in the Old Testament, but I love it in the New Testament. Someone else can die for what someone else did, and it blows my mind because I have this love-hate relationship with it. But if I stand in that tension, then I can have an imagination that beauty can actually come out of my mess, that it is offensive when these two things touch. It is offensive when time and eternity touch. It is offensive when heaven and earth overlap. It's offensive when God becomes a human. That's what the Pharisees said. They tried to kill him. They wanted to kill him because it was offensive that God and humanity would touch. It is offensive, the goriness of the cross, that sinfulness and holiness would touch on the cross is offensive. But it's beautiful when death touches life in the tomb. It's beautiful when spirit touches humanity at Pentecost. It's beautiful when grace touches my mess and in the church. But it's the same coin. And sometimes I think our unwillingness to allow God to do that blinds us from seeing him doing this. It's one coin, and it's really hard. It's hard to be gracious to people who don't deserve it. But I'm saying you have to. You have to. Because if you don't, you cannot see it in its fullness and in its glory here. Not only that, God has used this thing to bring about this thing. What do you do when God uses a horrible situation to bring out a beautiful situation? If you hate it, you're gonna miss it. Because when you have a horrible situation, you have no imagination that he could bring beauty out of that too. And I don't want you to miss it. I want you to know that there's no place that you can go where God can't find you, that no matter what has been done to you, someone could have wronged you, God knows how to take a mess and turn it into a miracle. He knows how to bring a king out of a crisis. He knows how to bring beauty out of ashes. So when my life goes up in flames, I'm not concerned because I've seen what God could do and I've said yes to it in David, even though I hate it. I say yes to it in Christ because I can receive it. So I want you to have an imagination that in your sickness, in your doubt, in your debt, in your loss, in your pain, that God can actually bring something beautiful out of it. Baby, not just heal it. I'm not saying that he just wants to heal it so you'll be okay. I'm saying he could bring up something far more beautiful than you would ever expect out of it. That ministries are birthed out of a mess. So I don't want you to hide it or cover it. I want you to bring it to God. Some of the greatest ministries ever birthed in the earth were not birthed through people who were theologically correct and had a great history. They were birthed out of people who suffered and who had hardship and laid down and died. And then afterwards, they got up, they washed up, they dressed up, and they worshiped. And God said, I'm going to bring a king out of that crisis. I'm going to bring beauty out of those ashes. Friends and family, that's why I want you to stay in the game. That's why I want you to stay in the game. That's why I want you to have a sight of what God can do through horrible things. I'm asking the worship team to join me here. This is a really hard space for us to stand in because I'm asking you to do something that the rest of the world has refused to do already. I'm asking you to have an imagination that if you take the things that keep coming up, the things that are hard, the things that are harmful, the things you try to hide, if you take all of those things, all of them, and instead of trying to cover it and hide it, you just begin to bring it to God. And just say, Lord, I will give you all of this if you give me all of you. I want to see you begin to take this messy situation, this messy history of mine, and bring a miracle out of it. I'm not saying it's going to happen instantaneously. I'm saying over a period of time that if you trust him with ashes, he will give you beauty. But if you hide them, if you keep them from him, you miss the opportunity to see what God can do. Here's a couple of things I want to invite you to do here today. I believe that as I'm asking you to give yourself to the Lord, I want to remind you that God will not ask you to do anything that he's not willing to do. Okay? God will never ask you to do anything that he's not willing to do. In fact, he always goes first. He'll never tell you to love him without loving you first. He'll never tell you to sacrifice without sacrificing to you first. He would never say to give me glory until he gives you glory first. And I want you to know that God has given himself to you, that he's hidden nothing from you. He's given you both sides of the coin of who he is. Some of it is great and some of it is not. You guys remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about the lion? Is he safe? Of course he's not safe. He's a lion. I'm not looking for safety. He's good. Is God safe? No. He's a lion. He's the lion of the tribe of Judah. He speaks and nations are formed. And he speaks and then they're deformed. It's not safe, but he's good. He's good. And this God who is good will give himself to you. And whatever your life looks like right now, whatever things, maybe as I'm talking, you realize that, hey, these are things in my history that I've tried to hide and cover up and try to move past it. I've tried to deal with it in a certain way, but the Lord keeps bringing them up. I just can't shake it. It keeps on being there. I'm trying to tell you that maybe the things that you're trying to hide, that God wants to have it. But what he does first is he doesn't tell you to give me everything. What he does is he gives you everything first. He will first be good to you and then say, now be good to me back. Today, I want to end our time with communion. There's some communion tables on the side, as this is the perfect picture given to the church of God giving himself wholly to you. He goes first. I want to encourage you to give yourself wholly to him. But first, I need you to receive him giving himself wholly to you. That he goes first. And today, here's how I want to do this. I want to try it. See if it'll work. There's something that maybe you have been like just in the space of being down, of being like in the mud, of grieving, maybe something habitual, maybe something you've been trying to hide. Like you've just been like low down there. Like maybe you've been kicked down and stepped on and in a low place. You have grieved and you've cried. Maybe it's been in your 20s and you're in your 50s and it's still happening. It's not if God will be good. I believe that God actually wants to grant the courage today to be able to get up, to wash up, to dress up, and to worship. That there's something about this. It's time to move. If you've been in a situation for longer than you think that you should be there, I can't tell you how long. I don't know your timeline, but you know I've been in this for too long. That maybe your clock is telling you it's time and your compass is telling you to move. And if you find yourself in that space today, maybe as a prophetic act, here's what I want to ask you to do. We're all going to take communion together, but if you have been in a place where this word is for you, that you need to get up, it's time to wash up, it's time to dress up, and it's time to worship. That you've been in that space for too long, and God is just saying, hey, it's time to move. And if you're in that space, I would love to offer you communion first. And I would love for us to receive you first in that space. The communion elements are on the side. Everyone is going to join you shortly, right? But what this allows us to do is just to realize at least the first part of what I'm sharing here. It could just be one of you, it could just be two of you. Would you hang out by the table? You don't need to bring it back to your chairs. Just stay there. We're going to take communion together. If that is you, I want you to begin to make your way to a communion table. If you know, hey, it's time to get up, it's time to wash up, it's time to dress up, and it's time to worship. Maybe it's something that you didn't understand, that it is unfair, this should not have happened, and I hate it, I prayed, and it didn't work. And maybe the Lord is saying, hey, it's time to get up, it's time to wash up, it's time to put on your clothes. Listen, this is what David did. David came to a place where David had to walk past people who knew everything that happened to him. They knew his shame. To walk through the king's castle, where everybody's judging your stuff and everybody knows you. But God would say, it's time for you to get up. It's time for you to wash up, dress up, and it's time to worship. And he wants to give himself to you. Everyone's going to join you in a moment. I just want you to stay there if that's you. And I want you to look around that there's other people with you. That you are more privileged than David, who grieved alone. That God actually wants to take this thing that you've grieved over, that you've mourned over, that you've lamented over, that you've been stuck in. I want you to hear me clearly. God wants to take whatever it is that's drawing you to the table right now. He wants to take it and say to you, hey, I know how to take a miracle out of a mess. I know how to birth a king out of a crisis. I know how to bring beauty out of ashes. And it starts here. And it starts here. As you're there, just hold your communion elements for a moment. I would love to pray for you. If you're still here, would you just extend your attention and your affection to these folks on the side of the room, if you would? One of the ways we do that is we just extend our hands, we extend a prayer. We actually want to bless you. We actually want to bless the miracle that God can bring out of your mess. That as you choose to get up, as you choose to wash up, as you choose to dress up and worship, as you choose to move from a hard place, that we want to say, yes, it's time to move, and it takes so much courage to move, and you're moving. And we are proud of your courage, and so is the Lord. And he will bring healing, but not just healing. He'll bring glory. He wants to bring glory out of it.